Our first problem is, for the reaction shown, calculate how many moles of each product form when the given amount of each reactant completely reacts. Assume there is more than enough of the other reactant. So we have our complete balanced chemical equation here. And our first reactant is PBS, and it's giving us 2.4 moles. So we need to use that to find out how many moles of PBO form and SO2 form. So first, we're going to start with what we're given, which is the 2.4 moles. Okay, so now let's start off with finding out how many moles of PBO are produced. So we have 2 moles of PBO for every 2 moles of PBS. Okay, so our moles of PBS cancels out, and we're left with moles of PBO. Okay, so when we do the math, we get, so 2.4 times 2 divided by 2 is 2.4 moles of PBO. Now let's figure out how many moles of SO2 are formed. So we always start with what we are given, which is the 2.4 moles of PBS. And in this case, there are 2 moles of SO2 for every 2 moles of PBS. So 2 moles of SO2 goes on top over our 2 moles of PBS. Okay, so our moles of PBS cancels out, and we do the math. We do 2.4 times 2 divided by 2 is equal to 2.4 moles of SO2. Okay, now it's asking for the moles of product formed when we get 2.4 moles of oxygen gas. So let's start with what we're given, which is the 2.4 moles of O2. Okay, so let's first figure out the number of moles of PBO. So there is 2 moles of PBO for every 3 moles of O2. So we have 2 moles of PBO for every 3 moles of O2. Moles of O2's cancels out. Now we just do the math. 2.4 times 2 divided by 3, and we get 1.6 moles of PBO. Now let's see how many moles of SO2 are formed. So we start with what we were given, which is the 2.4 moles of O2 times, there is 2 moles of SO2 for every 3 moles of O2. So we have 2 moles of SO2 for 3 moles of O2. Moles of O2's cancels out. So we do the math. 2.4 times 2 divided by 3, and we also get 1.6 moles of SO2. Next, it's asking how much moles are formed when we are given 5.3 moles of PBS. So first, let's figure out how many moles of PBO are formed. So we always start with what we are given, which is the 5.3 moles of PBS times, now we're doing moles of PBO, so there is 2 moles of PBO for every 2 moles of PBS. So we have 2 moles PBO for every 2 moles of PBS. our moles of PBS cancels out. So we do the math, 5.3 times 2 divided by 2, and we get 5.3 moles of PBO. Next, let's figure out how many moles of SO2 are formed. So we'll always start with what we were given, which is the 5.3 moles of PBS times, now this has the same ratio, there's 2 moles of SO2 for every 2 moles of PBS. Okay, the moles of PBS cancels out, and we're also left with 5.3 moles of SO2. Last, it gives us 5.3 moles of oxygen gas. So the same thing, we need to figure out how many moles of PBO are formed and how many moles of SO2 are formed. Okay, so let's start with what we're given, which is the 5.3 moles of O2 times, there's 2 moles of PBO for every 3 moles of oxygen gas. So we have 2 moles PBO for every 3 moles of O2. Moles of O2 cancels out. 5.3 times 2 divided by 3 is 3.5 moles of PBO. Now let's figure out how many moles of SO2 are formed. So let's start with what we're given, which is the 5.3 moles of O2. Now, this has the same ratio as PBO to O2. So there's 2 moles of SO2 for every 3 moles of oxygen gas. The moles of O2 cancels out, and we are left with 3.5 moles of SO2.